This video is for you if you've ever wanted to pick up a welder and make something, but you really don't know where to start, or if you've picked up a welder and frankly it terrified you and the result was crap anyway, so you mothballed it, but you still harbour the desire. I'm going to cover it off in two parts because this really is a big topic and it makes sense to cut it logically in half. The first bit, which we're doing now, is what stuff do you need? Starting with a welder, but all of the other stuff you're going to need to do a decent job welding. And we're going to drill down into all the different processes and narrow it down to the two that I think you should start with. Part two is going to be, we're going to head off all of the major catastrophes, right? So there are major health catastrophes if you weld wrong or you just don't appreciate some of the risks. But there's also a whole bunch of considerations like polarity and current and voltage and how they interact together with MIG welding and things like that. I see people, newbies, unbox welders on YouTube all the time and they have a crack, and I get why they're making the same mistakes over and over, but if they just had someone to say, hey, why don't you do it like this? It'll be better. Then their welds would improve dramatically and quickly. Obviously, the best way to learn welding is at welding school or in industry, which is a proxy for welding school anyway. But hopefully part one and part two here will be the next best thing, or at least give you some form of acceleration apropos of the learning curve, and also manage to avoid you putting yourself needlessly at risk, because it's very easy to do that. So without further ado, here's the stuff that I'd suggest you get if you want to have a red hot crack at welding and not blow it, and be sort of future-proofing yourself along the way. I've set myself arbitrarily a budget of about $1,000 here, because you can certainly cheap out and start welding a lot more cheaply than that, but you can't probably do everything that you would want to do at home. You won't be future-proof, so if you wanted to do TIG later or you want to do gas welding later, you'd probably have to go again with a full-on additional investment. So let's just do two processes. There's all kinds of processes. There's all kinds of gas-based processes like TIG and gas-shielded MIG welding. They call it GMAW, gas metal arc welding in industry. We're going to leave that to one side. And the basic reason for that, although you can get some fantastic results, TIG is a bit of a snob welding thing and you don't need to learn it off the bat. It's a nice skill to have. It's kind of fun to do, but you need a gas bottle for that. And if you buy a gas bottle like hip high, like an E-sized gas bottle, one way or another, it's going to cost you about $500. You know, you're going to either have to buy the bottle and then exchange it for refills for about 110, 120 bucks a bottle, right, to refill for the exchange. But the upfront investment's going to be about $500. And that seems a little bit expensive to me for something that you might decide that, hey, I don't really like that. It scares me a bit, whatever, you know. Your need might not be that profound. You might only want to do one or two jobs, you know. And to me, it just blows the budget. The other thing is, if you want to do MIG and TIG, odds on, you're going to need two different gases, means two different bottles, means $1,000 up front. And that's going to blow our limit. We're not going to have any of this stuff, okay? So all the gas processes, let's just leave them to one side, but let us invest in a welding machine that at least is compatible with some of those processes down the track if we want to upgrade, because we really get into it, you know? So there's another MIG process, which is called FCAW, flux cord arc welding, also called gasless MIG. And I think that's the place to start because you can get a decent result out of it. In many ways, it's more versatile and more practical and better than the gas shielded form of MIG welding. And it's so accessible because you don't need to make the big investment in the gas, right? They use flux cord arc welding to build boats and bridges, and they actually use exactly this wire here that I've got installed in the welder. So any suggestion that the process is inferior structurally is just flat out bullshit. What it is inferior at is aesthetically. Gas shielded MIG looks better and it needs less cleaning up. You can generally paint straight over it off the bat without grinding the crap out of it. There's less spatter, things of that nature, but from a structural point of view, The flux cord stuff is great. And we're also going to do stick welding because the two processes are oddly similar and they go together because the wire feed MIG process is good for the thinner steel and the stick welding is good for the thicker stuff. So if you buy yourself a multi-process machine, which this is, you'll be able to do both. You won't need two boxes. You can just pick it up and go. The other thing about all the flux cord processes is you can use them outside. So if you need to do on-site repairs, you don't need to worry about if it's a windy day. If you're using a gas shielded process, you can't use it in the wind because the gas shielding, the thing people don't appreciate about molten steel is that it's highly reactive and it loves to react with atmospheric oxygen. And when that happens, the welds are crap, meaning they're not strong enough and they look lousy, they don't penetrate, blah, blah, blah. So you don't want that. If you gas shielded welding and you're outside and it's a windy day, the shield is literally in the wind and your welds are crap and there's nothing that you can do about it. Whereas if you're flux welding, you can do that anywhere. You can do it in here, you can do it out there, you can do it on a windy day. It's all good, dude, because the flux melts and it forms like a liquid blanket that goes over the top of, floats on top of the molten steel and deprives it of access to atmospheric oxygen. So you can do it out there in the wind, you can do it in air, it's all good. The difference between the two processes is that when you use the wire, which comes on a spool like this, it's actually hollow wire and the flux is on the inside. You can't really see it. There's only a tiny amount of it. The total diameter of this wire and the wire that comes with the machine is 0.8 of a millimeter. So it's got a really small tube of flux inside it, but just enough to do that blanket floaty thing before it freezes, okay? When you're stick welding, it's an inversion of the way the wire is structured because the flux is on the outside and the wire is on the inside, but it's equally effective from a deprive it of oxygen sort of functional standpoint, right? So what you need to do is you go, well, what's flux core good at and what is stick welding good at? And essentially, below about 5 millimeters in thickness, like material thickness that you're welding, flux core, okay? That works just fine. You can use it for all of that. Above about 3 millimeters, stick welding, but the thinner it is, the easier it is to blow holes in the material when you're stick welding. And yeah, there's a bit of overlap. Now, this machine is a Vevor MIG 270 and it'll run 0.8 millimeter flux cord wire all day long. So below about 4 millimeters, you'll be fine. Maybe 5 millimeters, just depends. You know, you can run it a bit more slowly, but you're maxing it out if you're in that 4 to 5 millimeter range for a single pass of weld bead, you know, if you want decent fusion and decent strength. Whereas this machine will run both 2.5 millimeter and 3.2 millimeter stick welding electrodes, which are just really good for the thicker stuff. So it's a no-brainer. If you're welding 5, 6 millimeter or thicker steel, then stick weld it because that'll just be the easiest, most efficient process. It's really easy to change between the two mechanisms. There's just a switch here. It's got stick welding called MMA, manual metal arc welding on one side and MIG on the other side. And the total price of this machine is like $370 odd, right? So to me, it's not a cheap welder. It's not the cheapest welder you can buy, but it's kind of upgradable because it's got a gas system inside it. So if you want to move later on to a gas shielded MIG process, then you can do that. You just get yourself a bottle and a regulator and plug it in and Bob's your mother's brother, right? It'll also do TIG. In fact, it comes with a TIG torch. Like, here's a brand new TIG torch that it comes with, still in the plastic because I haven't gotten it out of the blocks yet. And to make that work, I'd need to go and get the tungsten. And it's not the subject of this video anyway, but at least it comes with a TIG torch. So if you want to play with that, you can do that. So, yay. Okay, what you need to realize about machines like this is that the polarity really matters, all right? So this lead here tells you what the polarity of your torch is going to be. So if you're MIG welding, one of the things that people get wrong all the time with MIG welding is the polarity. If you're MIG welding with a gas shielded, the torch has to be positive. But if you're MIG welding with flux core, it has to be negative. And if you're just drowning in spatter and you can't get the weld to look any good, guaranteed the polarity is wrong. If your flux core and the torch is positive, the welds will be crap, no matter how hard you try to do everything else right. So just bear that in mind. The other thing about this is the standard torch that comes with the MIG 270. And I love it because it's a standard welding torch. This thing is called a BINS L15 welding torch. And that means that's sort of a design standard, and you can walk into any welding shop around the country and get the consumable parts for a BINS L15 torch. In fact, this is a gas shielded nozzle on the outside of the torch. It's held there by a spring. They don't come loose in practice. But if you want to protect all the inside pieces, like the contact tip and the gas diffuser from all of the junk that comes off the flux, you can get one of these BINS L15 flux core nozzles, and it makes it much easier to see the contact tip. It's got a protective ceramic ring on the inside, so the inner workings of the torch don't get gummed up as you use it, and it's much easier to manage a thing called your stick out with the wire if you fit this sort of aftermarket accessory. Just it works really well, and it's a very worthwhile upgrade. You buy them in packs of 2 for under 30 bucks, so that's not going to break the bank either. When it comes to the actual stick welding part of the equation, then the leads are okay. You know, they're better than some welders that I've used. My main gripe with the leads actually is that they're not long enough. They're only about 3 meters long, which is fine if you've got the welder here on your bench and you're working here. That's great, you know. But if your welder's over here and you're building a gate, then you're going to need a lead that's longer than 3 meters. And the length of the standard welding lead is just going to get old, and ditto the work clamp as well, because sometimes you want to get the work, you want to clamp to the work and you want to have the welder a bit further away, and it's difficult to do that with these short leads, but they're okay to get going. Once again though, the connectors here, they're called DINS connectors. They're just like a bayonet, and you plug them in, twist a bit until they go positively home, and then you know, you're good to go. But it's easy to upgrade them as well. And because I got the dirts with a whole bunch of leads I had with cheaper welders in the past, I went to the trouble like about a year ago to upgrade. Just hang on a sec. For under 200 bucks, you can get yourself a nicely upgraded set of really long leads. You get a much better electrode holder as well. So I've got about 2 hours worth of welding now on the MIG 270, and I'm super impressed with it. It works just fine. It's got a reasonable duty cycle. I was using it in the sun. It was a reasonably hot day. It never went for that whole over temp thing. And what I did initially was what I'd suggest anybody do when they're learning to weld, which is I just got a piece of scrap steel and I just put different beads down on it. I welded about 2 inches long, stopped, cleaned up the weld, had a look, tweaked the settings, go again, over and over and over with both processes, the stick process and the wire feed process, okay? And it's necessary to do that because all welders are different. You just need to make friends with yours. I made friends with this one. It functions just fine. And I didn't use the upgraded leads. I was pretty careful to use everything that just comes standard with the welder. So in terms of the consumables, the MIG 270 comes with this roll of flux cored wire. It's 0.8 millimeters. The whole setup is geared up to run 0.8 just fine. It'll also run 1.0 millimeter wire, which is a little bit uncommon, at least it is here in Australia. I normally see 0.8, 0.9 and 1.2. They seem to be the most common sizes. 0.8 and 0.9 for the kinds of welders that you would use in your shed. You know, if you're not from around here, come from an imperial country, 0.8 is 30 thousandths of an inch and 0.9 is 35 thousandths of an inch. They're the common sizes of wire. Now, the wire that comes with the machine is called E71T-GS, and don't worry about the E71T, but the -GS really means that it's not good at multiple passes. You'll interfere with the metallurgical properties of the weld if you do multiple passes. So the wire that comes with the machine is just fine if you want to do a sheet metal repair out in the field, or you got some rusty stuff on the side wall of the main bit of your trailer and you just want to cut out a section of that and fix it up, you know, that'll be fine because you only sort of do that in one pass, right? But if you've got something thick and you want to do multiple passes, anytime you look at the wire, if it's got -GS at the end of it, that wire is really not appropriate for that multiple pass welding. You need to get a different kind of very similar wire that's also called E71T, except it's -11. And the -11 stuff is the chemical composition, if you like, structural metallurgical composition that they use in industry for multi-passes quite often, you know, in shipyards and building bridges, blah, blah, blah. So it's probably better just to work with the E71T-11 wire when you're actually doing jobs yourself, because you don't want to have to shift between the GS and the 11 because changing the wire out all the time is such a pain in the ass. Just work with the -11 stuff and then you can do single pass welding, no problem. But if you're suddenly faced with having to touch up a weld that didn't penetrate as deeply, or didn't wet both sides, whatever, then you can just go over the top again without worrying about whether or not it's going to fail. So 71T-11, okay? When you look at different welding consumables, you go to a shop, right? You're confounded with all these brand names, like Unimig has got Hypermig, sounds great, doesn't it? And Boss Weld Technology has got BT something written all over it, but when you drill down into the fine print, it'll say E71T-11, and that's the stuff that you want. And that's exactly what both of these rolls are also. One of the things I really like about this welder is that a lot of the really cheap welders will only take these small sort of 1 kilo spools, whereas this MiG 270 from Vevor is compatible with these big 5 kilo spools, which are 200-ish mil in diameter, and that means 5 times less changing the wire, replacing the spool, right? You just put a big spool on, it's going to last for 5 times longer. Now, when it comes to stick welding electrodes like these babies, you're going to need a bunch of them as well. And there's a difference between America and Australia, right, and Europe. In America, they tend to use a thing called a 7018 electrode. They're fine. They're called low highs, right, for low hydrogen. They need to be stored in a particular way to deliver the higher strength low hydrogen thing. You need not worry about that if you're just welding, you know, barbecue plates and workbenches and things of that nature. But if you're welding a gas pipeline that goes hundreds of miles, then you really do need to worry about the storage conditions. In the shed, not so much. When you go to Bunnings, you're unlikely to find 7018. You might find it, but it's far less common in Europe and Australia. What we have is 6013, okay, generally, like for general purpose electrodes. And I'd suggest you get yourself a 5 kilo spool of the wire we just talked about and a 5 kilo box of 2.5 millimeter 6013 electrodes. They can be any brand. You just have to have a look at the fine print and it'll say 6013, okay? The 60 is the tensile strength of the material in thousands of pounds per square inch. So 6013, the 60 is 60,000 pounds per square inch. And that means if you run a weld bead that's 1 inch long and 1/4 of an inch thick sort of thing, then that's going to be 1/4 of a square inch, and 1/4 of 60 is going to be 15,000 pounds of tensile strength. And if you put a tack in there that's 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch, that's going to be 1/4 of that. So that's going to be roughly 4,000 pounds or 2 Hiluxes of clamping force. And that's why you tack everything together, because it's a really effective clamping system. Stops it moving when you weld it together. Anyway, get yourself a box of 6013 electrodes. The one after the 60 just means any position, meaning straight down, straight up, overhead. But where possible, just weld straight down because it's much easier. You need a much higher level of skill to weld vertically up or overhead. But it's nice to know that the electrodes will do all of that when you need them to. So there's that. And then the final digit just means, it just tells you about the composition of the flux and the characteristics of the electrode, and that's a subject for a whole nother day. But 6013 will be fine. ER70, whatever, ER71-11 is what you want for the wire, and then you're good to go from a machine point of view. So I thoroughly recommend this machine. It's so much better than buying a cheap sort of $100 box that'll only stick weld, because it'll really expand your envelope of capability. It'll allow you to do sheet metal. And if you just buy a standalone gasless MIG, then welding thick stuff is going to be a proper pain in the ass, so you don't want that. I'll put a link in the description to the MIG 270, and there'll be a code there as well that you can get 5% off. So that'll help us stick within the $1,000 budget. But I've driven this welder pretty hard for a couple of hours now in some fairly warm conditions and didn't blow the duty cycle once. So that's encouraging, and it's so much better than, you know, those standalone sort of cheaper welders you can buy. You can buy a really cheap stick welder, but that won't allow you to do sheet metal, and you can buy a really cheap gasless MIG and you won't be able to weld anything thick. And by the time you buy one of each, then you might as well buy one box that'll do it all, that you can carry just like a briefcase to whatever job you've got to do. I'd also put all the consumables that it comes with in some storage mechanism where you can't lose it. The other thing I'd suggest is, if you're going to work around the same environment all the time, a cart is not a bad thing to get. And I got the matching Vevor cart for this, and they're quite affordable in that sort of sub $200 range. Takes about 30 minutes to put together. It's quite well thought out from an assembly point of view. It's got 4 drawers, and that means all of your common welding stuff, the stuff that is bespoke to welding, that you need with you when you go welding. You can put a spare reel of wire, you can put a box of electrodes, you can put all of the consumables, you can put all of the hand tools that you might need and a few magnets, blah, 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 and it'll give you somewhere to store the cable, because once you've got the wire installed, you kind of have to leave the MIG torch in place, and therefore if you need to move it around, it's nice to be able to wheel it around on a trolley, because the trolley's got cable storage and management. Likewise, if you're going to MIG weld and you don't need your stick welder, then that gives you somewhere to put the stick welding electrode as well. The other thing a dedicated trolley's got, and this is really important if you upgrade to gas and you want to move around with it, is it gives you somewhere safe to store the cylinder, because when you've got the cylinder connected to the welder with a regulator on top, the last thing you want to do is drop it, because the top of the cylinder is vulnerable to mechanical damage, and you don't want 2,000 whatever PSI of gas just all erupting out of the cylinder at once. That's kind of unthinkable, and a trolley really makes the security of the cylinder much better. You lock it in place with chains, and it's much harder just inadvertently to bump it and tip it over, which is something you really want to avoid at basically all costs. So they work together really well. Another thing that I got from Vevor, which we should talk about just briefly, is more of a safety thing. And these, you should get one of these off the bat. This is a welding blanket. It's basically a fiberglass tarpaulin that doesn't burn. And here's a couple of practical applications for why you need this. This is 6 foot by 10 foot, so in our money that's 2 meters by a bit more than 3. And the reason you need it is like this. Let's say one of your mates figures out that you know how to weld, and you've got this nice portable welder, and he's just broken off the stud that holds the mounting flange of the exhaust pipe to the exhaust manifold in his car, okay? This is a really common thing that happens when people spin spanners on cars that are more than 10 years old. The stud is really rusted up in there. They crank on the spanner, breaks a stud off, and all of a sudden you're looking at a couple of hours of entertaining repatriation, aren't you? So he knows that you've got this welder, and he knows that you can weld, and one of the ways you can get out of this problem is to get a nut. Doesn't have to be the right size nut, just has to be a nut. And you could weld it onto the broken end of the stud with your MIG welder. So yay. The only problem with this is there's a lot of things that'll burn inside the engine bay of a car, and some of those things are highly flammable. So what you want to do is you want to use your welding blanket and pretend that it's just like doing battlefield surgery, and you want to cover everything in the engine bay with flame-proof welding blanket except the area that you want to work on, so that there is no risk of burning the whole show to the ground. And the other application that springs immediately to mind is what I did a few weeks ago, which was I had this mulcher that's quite old, and it's got like a 5 horsepower Briggs & Stratton petrol engine, and it directly drives from the crank this rotating series of blades that just smash everything that you put into the chute. And that's been going great, except there's a couple of corners in the chute, and it's made of sheet metal, and the corners, the chute vibrates a bit when the machine works, and it's old, and the corners are stress risers, so a couple of fatigue cracks started to happen, and got to the point where I had to fix it because the chute is also the handle that you use to wheel, tip it up on its end and wheel it around on its wheels, you know. When you do jobs like that, you've got this internal combustion engine right here and you're welding right there, and sparks go everywhere, and part of the engine is its integrated fuel tank. It's got like 2 or 3, whatever, litres of petrol just there. And this is a terribly dangerous mix, right? So what you can do is you get your welding blanket and you just put a couple of layers of it over the engine, and you make sure that none of that spatter can interact with any of the parts that can burn on the engine. And it also keeps the vapor under control, because fuel systems in yard equipment, they're not sealed generally. So that's a bit of a worry as well. There's an explosion risk with the vapor in exactly the wrong conditions. So you should invest in your own safety with a welding blanket. It doesn't have to be this one, but you should absolutely get one. And anytime you're in an environment where there's a risk of fire or explosion and you can't mitigate it by physically removing the thing that can burn or blow up, then get out your welding blanket and keep things safe. Same could be said of doing work on location in Australia in summer when things are really dry and bushfire risk is really high. You could make an effective boundary between, let's say you're working up on a deck, you're welding a handrail together or repairing a handrail. You don't want any spatter falling off over the deck and then starting the world's biggest bonfire, right? And things like welding blankets can really reduce the risk of that danger, and they're so affordable. It's irresponsible, I guess you'd say, not to have one while you're welding. Now, there's a bunch of personal protective equipment you are going to need. Now, obviously, you're going to need a welding helmet. And my strong advice is get yourself an auto darkening welding helmet, because these ones that you have to lift up or pull back down, they're hopeless. Some cheap welders come with these handheld welding helmets, and they're just a joke, frankly. And the pipeline welders, I know, they still like their little manual helmets like this where you nod and tip the helmet down, but for the rest of us, the world has moved on, and auto darkening is really good. The other thing about auto darkening that not enough credit is given for is that an auto darkening helmet, you can see straight through it when you're not welding, but it's got a filter that blocks all of the UV and all of the infrared. So even if you flash yourself inadvertently and the auto darkening doesn't work, you're protected from the infrared and the ultraviolet regardless, okay? So that's kind of cool when you think about it. We should talk about the radiation from welding, because it is really dangerous. It's worse than sunlight. The sun produces full spectrum UV, like UVA, B and C, but the upper atmosphere of the Earth blocks the UVC. And the UVC is the most highly carcinogenic form of ultraviolet radiation. So you really need to block that. So if you want to do this responsibly, you've got to cover up, like totally cover up. it's not optional. And my advice would be to get yourself either a work shirt, like a heavy cotton work shirt, or you could get yourself one of these slightly flame-proof welding jackets. And the best thing about your welding jacket is it's a bit Dr. Evil, this welding jacket. But the cool thing about it, and the thing that you don't want to underestimate, is when you do it up, and I'm sorry if this makes the audio a bit shit, but I'll just prove the point, right? That I can carry off a pretty mean Dr. Evil, but also when you buy a welding jacket like this, there's a couple of countermeasures in place. One of which is there's no pockets on the outside here. So if you're a smoker, you can't put your Bic lighter in the top and blow yourself up. That's always good. And the top does up, and I'm sorry about the audio. The top does up like this, right? And that means that when you're welding, you can't get the UV exposure into your neck. That's really important. And the helmet works together with the top of the neck thing so that you're properly protected, right? Whereas if you've just got a work shirt on, it's likely to be a bit more V-type thing at the top, and people get a little bit lax with that kind of thing. And you don't want the bad news, do you? You know, from some dermatologist in 10 years or 20 years' time that, hey, you've got melanoma just here. Oh my God, I wonder what caused that. Now, while we're talking about these cheery topics, oh, incidentally, stand by. Okay, so if you are going to use a work shirt, one of the things you can do to protect your neck is you can go down to your local ghetto supply store and get yourself one of these service station robbing neck gaiter balaclava things, and you can adapt it from its intended purpose, and you can just put it around your neck like that. And that's not a bad countermeasure either. And people say all the time, I've heard all the crap, you know, I've heard all the crap about, I'm not going to, it's too hot, it's too uncomfortable, we're in Australia, it's really hot, and I'm not going to cover up. Well, that's on you, right? Don't say I didn't warn you about the UV, but the dermatologists all agree UVC is the most dangerous UV, and you're making a big ball of it just, in your lap. So the other thing you're going to need is gloves, okay? You're going to need a decent set of gloves. These are MIG welding gloves. They give you a little bit more feel. They're more mobile than these really heavy stick welding gloves, which are, much more rigid. It's difficult to use the trigger on the torch with these heavy stick welding gloves, but the stick welding gloves are better for, protecting your hands when you're doing the stick welding thing. I just tend to use these MIG welding gloves for everything. The thing to bear in mind, obviously, when you're wearing the gloves is that one glove is going to wear out first, and they don't sell them individually, so you're just going to have to come to terms with that. But irrespective of which welding you do, you're going to be welding with one hand, in my case left hand, and you're going to be supporting with this hand, because triangulation is really important for stability and control. And that means that this glove is just going to get bombarded with all the crap that comes off the weld, whereas this glove is going to be better protected. So don't feel special if one glove wears out first, dude. That is completely normal. Oh, the other thing I need to tell you about this welder, which is quite funny, is that it comes with these beautiful glasses, which is very Stevie Wonder, Quite dark also. Very Stevie Wonder when I think about it. Do not use them for welding, because your whole face is going to be just bombarded with excessive UV, and you will get sunburn if you don't cover up. But sunburn's the kind of thing you recover from, whereas what the UV does to your DNA, there's no coming back from that, okay? So you need to cover up properly. You need to wear long pants as well, and the pants need to go outside your boots, so that if you wear shorts, you only need to wear the shorts once, okay? And you only need to get one dirty big gob of spatter, molten steel that goes down the inside of your boots. That only needs to happen once until you go, yeah, the long pants. Right? Same thing with wearing running shoes like trainers. If they're nylon, synthetic type running shoes, then that's a real problem as well, because the spatter will go straight through them and burn the crap out of your tootsies. Now, Another thing, another really high fashion accessory that is worth considering if you're welding is a proper welding cap. Now, if you're just welding on a bench like this, you're not going to need it. Maybe you don't need to get it up front, but as soon as you start lying on the ground and welding something up underneath your workbench, as soon as you start working overhead, you're going to be like this, going to be welding like that, and there's going to be this shower of molten steel coming down like this. So you want to get yourself a welding cap, okay? And you want to wear it sideways. And in this case, this is not a concession to fashion. In no way is this a concession to fashion, right? But when you weld and you're welding overhead, like this, you've got the shower of crap coming down like this. Your face is protected by the helmet, but your ear's not. And the last thing you want to do, even worse than in the boot, dude, is getting a big gob of molten steel in your ear hole. That's memorable when that happens. So welding caps are cheap, they're quite comfy to wear. They actually distribute the load or soften up the harness on your helmet too, if you're going to be wearing the helmet for some time. So I think that's basically going to cover off our PPE, except to say that welding produces a whole bunch of smoke, and you would, at the very minimum, if you're going to be subjected to the smoke, like not working outside, head in a cloud of smoke sort of thing, you'd want, at the minimum, a P2 respirator, like a P2 mask. And when you're grinding, you know, because you're going to do a bit of grinding as well, you want to keep the mask on for the grinding because abrasives are pretty toxic as well, and you want to protect your hearing when you're grinding. So there's that. Speaking of grinding, it's a good idea to get yourself an angle grinder. In fact, get yourself 3 because maybe 4. I think 4 is the sort of minimum man's number of grinders, but one of the things that's going to really make working with welds a lot easier is one of these wire brushes, okay? And that's just going to make cleaning up the flux on the previous pass an easy sort of job, and it's going to do a better job than doing it manually. And you need to get it clean to go again. People underestimate how necessary cleanliness is to get a good result out of welding, and a wire brush is really good. It's also a good idea to get these sort of paint stripping discs, which are great for taking little bits of mill scale and little bits of galvanization and things like that off. It's also a good idea to have a flap disc to grind down ugly welds. And hey, we're all going to do ugly welds, and we're all going to do projects where the welds are going to be visible, and the flap disc is your friend. In fact, you would want to concentrate more on things like penetration and fusion with welding than you do on things like how they look. There's all of this emphasis on stacking those dimes, but quite often a lot of that manipulation to stack those dimes is directly compromising the integrity of the structure of the weld beneath it. So a flap disc is a great thing to have, as well as cut-off wheels, and by the time you add these up, there's a wire brush and a paint stripper and a flap disc and a cut-off wheel. And if you've got one grinder, you're going to be juggling wheels all day long, which is a great reason to get 4 grinders and just pick up the right one, have them on a rack down here or over there or something, and just pick up the one you need and do the job you need it to do, and then put it down, and next time you need another grinder, you don't have to juggle the frickin' wheels. So having said that, you're also going to need a wire brush. You're going to need a chipping hammer. Now, you could be a bit of a hoarder and have the same cheap-ass chipping hammer you got with your very first welder in 1987. It could do all the chipping that I've ever done and still be going strong with its original handle, because you really just scrape the stuff off and give it a brush with a wire brush, and Bob's your mother's brother. But you're going to need some form of chipping hammer. You could have one of these expensive and sort of innovative ones from Jason at Fireball Tool. This is a piece of tool steel with a stainless steel handle, and it works really well, and it's good at cleaning up spatter as well, but it's not your grandpappy's chipping hammer. You could make another one yourself out of a cold chisel, or you could get my favorite chipping hammer of all time, which is this Estwing one. No surprises there. Estwing make fantastic hammers generally, and the Estwing chipping hammer is probably, you know, the Rolls Royce of welding chipping hammers, if I think about it. So there's all of that, but you don't need to spend big bucks on a chipping hammer. They're kind of necessary. They do a good job, but you don't work really hard with one. And the cheap ones are fine for getting started. So what else is a good idea? I got a bunch of other things that are just not a bad idea. Nozzle gel, which sounds interesting, but it's really just a paste, like a waxy paste, that you can dip the torch of your MIG gun in, and it makes it easier to clean up all the crap that sticks onto the inside and the outside. You just do a pass, warm it up, stick it in, get a bit of a waxy coating on there, and go again. And if you're concerned, as many people are, about the spatter, in particular from flux core arc welding, then you can get yourself anti-spatter spray, which is not flammable, and yay, it's a good idea to have not flammable stuff anywhere near welding. It works really well and makes cleanup easy. You can spray your table down as well if you're welding on a steel table. It's a good idea to have that. Now, if you don't want to spend, you know, 20 bucks a can on anti-spatter spray, just go upstairs and take the cooking oil. Cooking oil works really well. This cheap-ass Coles canola oil spray works really well as an anti-spatter treatment prior to welding. Okay, so you just spray the job down, you spray your table down, whatever, works great. And when your wife comes looking for the, have you seen the cooking oil spray? You go, cooking oil spray? Just make her think she's losing her mind, dude. One thing I'd say about this though, Jesus, you've got to be disciplined. If you use aerosols, you've got to be so disciplined when you're welding, right? This is not a joke. I checked this one. I don't know what the propellant is in the actual anti-spatter spray, but this is oil in propane, right? Like LPG, barbecue gas, in a thin-walled container. If you put this on your welding table, it's going to be grounded by the machine. So it's going to be the negative of the circuit. And if you hold the torch, now obviously this is not plugged in and the welder's not turned on, right? But if you go like that, just once inadvertently, it's sitting on the table, you're going to release all of that propane and all of that oil. And it is going to be this far from your face, right? And that, frankly, is unthinkable. So if you are going to use any aerosol product at all, anti-spatter, whatever, you have to be so disciplined. You have to make a Roman centurion look like he's just goofing off, dude, because this cannot ever sit on the table. You can't put it down on the table. It has to go properly away, and it has to go properly away every time. If you make this mistake once, it's the last time you get to make that mistake, basically. So you need to just think about the kinds of things that can go wrong. We'll talk about that in video number 2. There's basically not that much else I can tell you about the stuff that you're going to need to get going out of the blocks. A magnet holder like this for the torch, that's not a bad idea. A bit of scrap steel to sit stuff on. When I got properly fed up with just running beads of weld on a plate, both in stick welding and flux core, I graduated to actually making something. And I wanted it to be representative of what might be perhaps a first project that you might attempt once you get fed up with running beads on a plate. I got this scrap angle, it's 4mm angle and 4mm thick, and I just cleaned it up with a wire brush, cut the miters into it. I used a scrap piece of this channel actually to just square it up and clamp it down. Then I tacked it out and I welded half of it with flux core and the other half with stick. I actually got a better result with the stick than the flux core, which is not unexpected given the thickness of the material kind of at the upper edge of what you might attempt with this flux core in this machine. But still got a good enough result with both processes. And in the case of the flux core not being quite as deep and quite as penetrating as I'd like, it's nothing a grinder's not going to fix. And I'd be quite happy to use this as a tray, put a wooden floor in it, store the bits that I need for the drill press over there, for example, like set of drills and chuck key and whatever else, the wedge for the Morse taper, and maybe a bit of lube, whatever you need, cutting fluid, you know, it'll fit all in that, and I can clamp it to the unused bit at the column, and that'll work just fine and probably last well longer than I will. So this is the kind of thing that you might aspire to, I guess, once you get sick of running those beads on that plate. And in the next video, I'm going to cover off exactly how to get from there to something like this with minimum risk and minimum pain and head scratching as well. So next week, dude, that would be a great reason for you to subscribe now so you get notified. And if this has helped you in any way, then pretty pleased with that. I know it's been a long video, but if you wanted to learn to weld, like, you'd probably have to go to welding school for 3 months or 6 months, and you'd probably be there once a week for 3 hours learning how to weld. So I think in terms of acceleration, the duration of this video has probably got you well down the track. And if it has, I'm glad it helped.